In the 1970s, Malick directed Badlands and Days of Heaven, two beautiful films that critics now treat as landmarks of modern American cinema. He was young, acclaimed, and it seems the studios were ready to give him more. And at that exact moment, instead of capitalizing on the momentum, he walked away from Hollywood completely. Between Days of Heaven in 1978 and The Thin Red Line in 1998, there were 20 years precisely. So what's happened? Why would a director with so much promise simply disappear? Before Terrence Malick ever stepped onto a film set, he was actually on track for an elite intellectual career. He studied philosophy at Harvard, and he focused on thinkers like Heidegger and Wittgenstein. That path led him to a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, where he continued his philosophical studies before leaving the program after disagreements over his thesis direction. Which is a background that, once I learned about, I feel like it made a lot of sense to what became his late philosophical approach to filmmaking. But instead of disappearing into academia, Malick bounced between worlds. He taught philosophy at the MIT, and at the same time, he worked as a freelance journalist, writing pieces for outlets like The New Yorker and Life, often wrestling with questions of politics, violence, and meaning that would later surface in his films too. Then he pivoted again, this time into cinema. Malick enrolled at the American Film Institute's Center for Advanced Film Studies in its early years, studying alongside a new generation of filmmakers like David Lynch and Paul Schrader. Within a few years, he made the leap from student to director with his first feature, Badlands, in 1973, a lyrical, unsettling take on a killing spree in the American Midwest. The film really impressed critics for its poetic approach, immediately granting him some recognition as a potential new voice in modern American cinema. His follow-up, Days of Heaven, in 1978, pushed that reputation even further. Shot largely at blue and golden hours, and mostly with natural light and a painterly approach to composition, it was a production obsessed with long waits for the right sky and an editing process that stretched on for years. When it was finally released, the film won Best Director at the Cannes Film Festival, and that cemented Malick's status as one of the most respected young directors in America back then. But behind this praise, Malick was actually, from what I could gather, collapsing due to the pressure of Days of Heaven.
We were trying to get 4 seasons in Alberta, Canada, starting in we started in August and went for maybe 3 or 4 months. We got freezing cold, and it was long drives to the locations. There was no money. We were living out of campers. On that level, it was extremely difficult.
The same perfectionism that produced those beautiful images also made the process nearly unbearable. Not just for him, though, also for the crew and for the studio, who had to wait longer for a finished product. In fact, rumors had it that the studio grew frustrated with the endless post-production, the spiraling timeline, and the director's reluctance to declare the film finished. However, looking at things from a different perspective, for Malick, editing wasn't just a technical aspect of the process, it was actually an existential process. Every decision felt like a risk of betraying what the film could be, and with the more control he exercised, the more he seemed to fear losing it. What I also think that happened was that the industry wanted a reliable and bankable director, and unsurprisingly, Malick possibly realized that he wasn't built for that type of environment and feeding into this machine. And so by the end of Days of Heaven, Malick was disappointed, not just with the process of making this film, but allegedly with the entire system that made films in that way. Many critics treated him as a once-in-a-generation talent, but also someone who felt misunderstood by the industry, which I believe to be true. And while Hollywood did see him as having the capacity to become maybe the next great American director, a potential Spielberg-level figure, in this case, in terms of return on investment, Malick became increasingly uncomfortable with attention and pressure, and he seemed to want the complete opposite, if you ask me. Malick wanted to disappear. And so he did. He vanished from public life, and after Days of Heaven, he left Hollywood entirely, moving to France and dropping out of the publicity ecosystem. And for roughly 2 decades, he gave essentially no interviews, no photographs, and cultivated no public persona at all. Stories circulated that he was living in a monastery, wandering Europe, or teaching and doing uncredited writing work in Europe. Studios and producers continued to send him scripts and offers, but they went into what felt like a void because they remained unresponded. And the weird thing from this angle is that he simply didn't stop directing or didn't stop working in cinema. It's almost as if he completely erased himself from the map. And so when he left Hollywood and settled in Europe, he spent much of this period focusing less on directing and more actually on the thinking, reading and writing, returning to his philosophical roots that actually had defined much of his life before cinema. He worked on translations and philosophical projects. He continued his studies and engagement on ideas of existence, time, and meaning. And these weren't just hobbies. They actually were extensions of the same concerns that had shaped Badlands and Days of Heaven, if you asked me, as well as his later work. And so what makes this period so interesting in my eyes is how completely he rejected the normal pressures of a director's career. In an era when directors were becoming brands, which is something that is still prevalent today, he chose anonymity. He developed new ideas about filmmaking based on more fluid structures, looser scripts, embracing improvisation, and a more exploratory approach to shooting. And so after 2 decades, he returned with The Thin Red Line, a World War II film that looked and felt nothing like a conventional war movie. And the reactions were quite interesting. A director many assumed was gone forever suddenly reappeared with a major studio project, adapted from James Jones's novel and shot with the same lyrical, nature-obsessed gaze that had defined previous movies. The cast alone shows how powerful his myth had become as a director, since this movie features an almost absurd collection of actors, from Sean Penn to Adrien Brody, George Clooney, John Cusack, Nick Nolte, Elias Koteas, among others, many of whom reportedly signed on with little to no idea of how large their roles would be. Some actors later discovered that most of their performance had been cut in the editing.
And then he edits his films in such a way that he cuts everybody out of them, you know, the story of Adrien Brody.
Didn't even know.
Going to the premiere
He was
and not
the lead.
seeing himself on the
He was the
screen.
lead in the movie.
Yeah.
I was in that film. I was cut out too. I was happy.
The Thin Red.
But apparently, they had agreed to work with Malick simply for the chance to be inside his process. The film went on to earn 7 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture and Best Director, yet Malick maintained his distance. He did not attend the ceremony, keeping the same aversion to publicity that had very much defined his exile. Visually and philosophically speaking, I think The Thin Red Line challenges the standards of a studio war film because it's dense with voiceover, digressive tone, and an overall concern with inner consciousness, a focus on the presence of nature rather than following traditional plots. What followed in the 2000s and 2010s was what many consider to be the most prolific period of his career. After The New World in 2005, Malick entered a new phase with films like The Tree of Life in 2011, To the Wonder in 2012, Knight of Cups 2015, and Song to Song 2017. The Tree of Life, which curiously was my first contact with Malick's work, particularly became a kind of landmark, winning the Palme d'Or at Cannes, earning multiple Oscar nominations and splitting audiences with its blend of family drama, cosmic imagery, and almost, I would say, a prayer-like voiceover. And these later films, in essence, are a bit more looser, more experimental, and often are built in the editing from vast amounts of footage shot with cameras that seem to endlessly roam through the scene and around the actors, relying on very minimal traditional scripting. Some critics and viewers were enthralled with these techniques, while others were clearly frustrated. But what they all seemed to reflect on was the total artistic freedom that the directors seemed to experience. Malick was now working almost entirely inside his own grammar of cinema, with producers and actors signing on knowing they were entering his world and not the other way around. And when the director chose to return to cinema, he did so not by returning to Hollywood, but by making a return to his own previously established universe. And his journey from prodigy to exile to quote-unquote myth and being an uncompromising author changed not just how films looked, but also what a director's career is allowed to be. And in Malick's case, that is unpredictable, private, and wholly devoted to the work rather than the spotlight. Thanks for watching.